So as of September 1st, 2025, the laws in the state of Texas changed so that now it's a lot easier to get rid of squatters. The problem, however, is that not every county is totally up to date on what to do with the new laws. Hence, we've been getting a lot of questions from landlords all over the state of Texas who are asking, what do we do if the constable isn't aware of the changes in the law? Do I have to file an eviction just because they say I do? Or can I actually utilize the property code? And if so, I know that the legislature signed a law, but where do I look and how do I instruct a constable who otherwise is unfamiliar with changes in the law? One thing you could do is point out to a couple of provisions in the law that any constable should be able to review. In fact, you can show up to the constable's office with copies printed on from the online form where you can find all legislative updates and copies of every single legal code signed into law. If you look in the description of today's video, I'm going to cite a link where I go to get copies of every single code that I discuss. Today I'm going to talk about two different codes, the penal code and the property code. So there are two sections out of the penal code that are important, 32.56 and 32.57. And both of these are important in squatting situations when someone is attempting to say, I'm here based on a written lease, or because I own the property and you know that they're using fake documents, either a fake lease signed by some landlord who never had the right to sign, or some property manager who never had authority to sign on your behalf because you're the owner and you know you didn't give that stated person any authority to enter into this contract. This sort of thing happens when a savvy professional tenant steps in knowing that it's going to be hard for you to prove when they say, oh, I was approached by such and such and they presented this lease and they told me that they had the authority. I don't know where they are now, but here's my lease and here's a receipt for my rent payment. In fact, I've got a deposit. I paid 6 months in advance. Well, how does the penal code help in a situation like this? Well, it helps in two ways. First, it establishes out of 32.56 that it is illegal to present a fake lease. So that lease that the individual who's now residing on your property shows you is fake because you never authorized it. And so the lease itself is fake, so that if someone really did get swindled, well, now they've got a claim against some other party who sold them fake documents. So it's a crime for an individual to present a fake lease. It's also a crime for someone to list property, to sell property, or to lease property without authority, so that the document that's in front of you, prepared by somebody else without your authority, is criminally void. It just doesn't have any power, and you don't have to accept it as that person's rightful entry onto your property. Now, that's important because of the changes in the Texas Property Code. Section 24B of the Property Code is a brand new section that came into law September 1st, 2025. And what Section 24B talks about is the squatter situation, where someone comes in and claims a right through false documents or with absolutely no right written in any document. So when somebody just walks in again, on the basis of fraudulent documents, you have the right to have them removed. And there are 5 subsections in 24B that you can point out, again, to any constable that now give you the right to have them removed without the need for an eviction. And here's the basic breakdown. Section 24B.001 explains first that a landlord has the right to have a squatter removed. Section 2 is the form. It explains the things that an owner would swear to have a squatter removed from property where they had no authorization to be. Point 003 of 24B is the process, the steps that the constable should follow in order to carry out the removal of someone who is unauthorized to be on the property. And point 004 is the section that says that the constable has no liability for removing someone under this section of the property code. The final section, 24B.005, explains that if someone uses this and wrongfully removes somebody from their property, there are some pretty stiff consequences that come along. But it should be clear from 24B.001 what your right is with regard to a squatter, someone who enters either by false pretenses with a fake lease or enters into your property without any permission whatsoever. Here's what the law says. 24B.001, the right to request removal of unauthorized occupant of a dwelling by sheriff or constable. Quote, notwithstanding any other law, an owner of residential real property or the owner's agent may request that the sheriff or constable of the county in which the property is located immediately remove a person who unlawfully entered and is occupying a dwelling on the property without the owner's consent. This can happen if the property was not open to the public when the person entered the property, and it is not the subject of a pending litigation between the owner and that person. The owner or owner's agent has directed the person to leave the property and the person has not done so. And, last requirement, the person is not a current or former tenant of the owner under an oral or written lease or an immediate family member of the owner. So, as long as all of these situations are present and you're on the right side of the law, you should be able to ask any sheriff or constable to have someone removed. Let's go back through this step by step. First, you have to be the owner or the owner's agent, and it has to be residential property. This does not apply to commercial units. Next, you have to show that the individual entered unlawfully. That's what we talk about section 32.56 and 32.57 of the penal code. If someone entered in this way, they entered in violation of the law and their entry was not lawful. Because of that, you can proceed with section 24B. Now remember, it has to be clear that the property was not otherwise open to the public. In other words, you can't say, well, I had an open house and that's how the person entered the property. As long as you can prove that at no time you made the house available to the public, you should be on good ground. Here's another easy one. You got to be able to prove that the property is not the subject of litigation between you and that individual. It could be that they are making a rightful claim to title, and if they are, then you cannot use this procedure. That title issue has to be resolved in the courts first before you can utilize 24B. The next section of 24B.001 says you have to have at least made a demand that the person leave. And the easiest way to prove that is with a notice to vacate. And so what we always recommend is find a way to be able to prove that you delivered a notice to vacate to the occupant. This is not the same as a notice to vacate in an eviction matter, but it does have some similar steps. And so if you can't prove that you gave the notice and you say, well, I orally told them, and they claim, I've never seen you before, I have no idea what you're talking about, then the constable or sheriff is probably going to turn you away and say, look, you haven't followed this step, and because you can't prove that you have, I'm not touching this. When you can prove that you've given them some notice that they're to leave because you are the actual owner and they don't have a right, then I will act. And so I don't think it's a very high bar. Send them a letter, post a notice, prove that you sent some kind of notice to them, making it clear that you are the owner and they're supposed to leave because they did not enter lawfully and do not have your permission to be there. Finally, and a lot of landlords get this wrong, the fact that someone overstayed their lease doesn't make them a squatter. The Section 3 of 24B.001 clearly says it can't be a former or a current tenant. They entered lawfully. You know who else entered lawfully? The guest of a former tenant. If you have someone who let their cousin in, even if they were an unauthorized occupant, if they entered as a guest, they entered lawfully, and you cannot have them removed through the squatter provision. 24B wouldn't apply to someone who was allowed onto the property by an actual tenant. Additionally, it can't be one of your immediate family members. So don't try to have somebody removed if you know they are immediate family. If you're unsure whether you meet all the qualifications, absolutely you're going to want to review that with a real estate attorney who is familiar with the law. There aren't a whole lot of them because this just popped up, but find somebody. If you're in the state of Texas, certainly you can come make an appointment with our office, and we'd be happy to talk to you about the kinds of things that are required in order to enforce Texas Property Code Section 24B. You do have that right, and if a constable or sheriff is simply unaware of it, you can point out to them the provisions out of the penal code that make fake leases a crime, and the provisions out of the Texas Property Code that create this mechanism for removing people who entered unlawfully. Unfortunately, it's going to take a little bit of time for the law to catch up with the implementation of the law. And it's true that a lot of people who have never seen this provision are going to find it a little bit surprising. But eventually it's going to catch on, and more people will become familiar with this section of the law. It's brand new. You might have to go check out that link in the description below and share the provision right out of the property code, right out of the penal code, so that you can establish that you have an absolute right to recover possession when a squatter has taken possession from you. I hope you found this both helpful and interesting. If that's the case and you liked what you saw, don't hesitate to give us a thumbs up. Hit that like button. If you have any questions or comments, anything you leave below, I'm going to respond to. I love responding personally to your questions and comments. And if you're not a subscriber yet, please consider subscribing. We appreciate that a lot. And certainly there are a ton of other videos on this channel that you will enjoy, where you can learn tons about landlording. We welcome you to check those out. YouTube seems to think that this video right here is the next best thing for you to watch. Check that out and come see us again every time we post something new. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.